On September 21, 19 BC, a 50-year-old man lay dying in a port city in southern Italy called Brundisium, what we now call Brindisi. He had spent the last 11 years of his life on a single poem. A poem that emperors had read aloud in tears. A poem that entire Roman audiences had reportedly fainted hearing. A poem that the most powerful man in the world considered the crowning literary achievement of his civilization. And the dying man's last wish was for it to be burned. After 11 years of composition, the meticulous Virgil did not consider the Aeneid fit for publication. He planned to spend 3 more years editing it, but fell ill returning from a trip to Greece. Just before his death, he ordered the manuscript of the Aeneid to be burned, because he still considered it unfinished. Augustus intervened, however, arranging for the poem to be published against Virgil's wishes. The emperor overruled the poet's dying wish. And because of that, because Augustus said no, we have the Aeneid. We have 12 books of Latin verse that shaped the imagination of Western civilization for over 2,000 years. We have Dante's Guide Through Hell. We have the founding myth of Europe. We have what T.S. Eliot would call, 20 centuries later, the classic of all Europe. All of it nearly burned. Who was this man who built the West and tried to destroy it? Who was this farm boy from the north of Italy who ended up writing the mythology of an empire, and who was so unsatisfied with his own masterpiece that he wanted it reduced to ash? Publius Virgilius Maro was born on October 15, 70 BC, in Andes, a small village near Mantua, north of the Po River in Cisalpine Gaul. The 5th century author Macrobius maintained that Virgil was born of country parents among the shrubs and woods. The passion for the rural life would remain with him throughout his adult life. That detail, born among shrubs and woods, is not decorative. It is the key to everything. Because Virgil never truly left the countryside, even when he lived in Rome. Even when he was composing the national epic of the Roman Empire, at the center of the most powerful political machine the ancient world had ever produced, some part of him was still standing in the fields near Mantua, listening to the sound of bees and the movement of water through irrigation channels. Virgil's father, either a potter or a laborer, worked for a certain Magius, who, attracted by the intelligence and industry of his employee, allowed him to marry his daughter. Because the marriage improved his position, Virgil's father was able to give his son the education reserved for children of higher status. This is the first of several moments in Virgil's life where fortune intervened in a way that felt almost scripted. Virgil was educated at Cremona, at Milan, and finally at Rome, acquiring a thorough knowledge of Greek and Roman authors, especially of the poets, and receiving detailed training in rhetoric and philosophy. One of his teachers was the Epicurean Cicero. The Epicurean influence matters enormously. Epicurus had taught that the highest human good was tranquility, ataraxia, a serene withdrawal from the storms of ambition and politics into the pleasures of simple life, friendship, and contemplation. Virgil absorbed this teaching so deeply that it would mark everything he ever wrote. He would spend his life in proximity to power, to Augustus, to the imperial court, to the whole machinery of Roman imperial propaganda, and he would never quite belong to it. He was always, in some fundamental sense, the man from Mantua who preferred the countryside. Although he was popular for his writing, Virgil was not a talented speaker and was reclusive for much of his life. He preferred to be away from Rome, and when he was compelled to go there and was recognized and hailed on the streets, he would flee for refuge into the nearest house. This is an extraordinary image, the most famous poet of Rome running away from his own fame, ducking into doorways to escape the people who loved his work. Fame terrified him. Public life exhausted him. He wrote about heroes and empires while preferring the company of bees. Virgil's life spans the bloody upheavals of the last decades of the violent Roman civil war and the first years of the era of order, stability, and peace created by Augustus. You cannot understand Virgil without understanding what that civil war meant. For most of his life, Rome was a place where the political order could collapse from one day to the next. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Caesar was assassinated. Antony and Octavian divided the empire. Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian at Actium. The violence was not abstract, it was agricultural, territorial, literal. Armies needed to be paid. And armies were paid with confiscated land. Virgil and his father were nearly displaced from their land after Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, when Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire, and Caesar's adopted son and sole heir, confiscated much of the land in the territory in order to reward army veterans. The farm of Virgil's father was among the land confiscated as payment for the victorious soldiers of the Battle of Philippi. But Augustus eventually restored the farm to the family. This experience, of watching the land that raised him nearly vanish into the appetite of war, left a permanent mark on Virgil's imagination. It explains the particular tenderness with which he writes about Italian soil, about farmers and vineyards and the slow rhythms of agricultural life. He knew what it meant to almost lose all of that. And it also explains, at least in part, his complicated relationship with Augustus. The man who had nearly taken his family's farm was also the man who gave it back. The man who ended the civil wars. The man who made peace possible. The first major poems that resulted from this period were the Eclogues, 10 short pastoral poems written roughly between 42 and 37 BC. They are, on the surface, poems about shepherds, idealized figures in an idealized landscape, singing of love and loss and the beauty of the countryside. But underneath the pastoral surface, the Eclogues are saturated with contemporary politics. The land confiscations appear directly in the first and ninth Eclogues, poets losing their farms, being forced into exile, the violation of the peaceful rural world by the violence of political power. Virgil is not really a man of the countryside. He has only the nostalgia of the urban intellectual for rural life, and in the beautiful line, "A God has made this leisure for us," in Latin, of course, the countryside appears as otium, as leisure, as refuge. Not as lived reality, but as longing. The style corresponds to this melancholy mistake, it is melodic and highly artificial. It is the poetry of someone who knows, with a certain sadness, that the world he is describing no longer quite exists, or perhaps never quite existed in the way he needs it to. After the Eclogues came what many scholars consider Virgil's most perfect achievement, a work that is frequently overlooked because it has the unglamorous label of didactic poem about farming. The Georgics. For books on agriculture, written between roughly 37 and 30 BC, dedicated to his patron Maecenas. But the Georgics are not a farming manual. They are something stranger and more beautiful than that, a sustained meditation on labor, on the relationship between human beings and the natural world, on what it means to tend something, land, animals, bees, civilization itself, with patience and care and without the guarantee of reward. The 4 books cover, respectively, field crops, trees and vines, livestock, and bees. And in each domain, Virgil does something remarkable. He brings a serene realism, a precise, attentive, unsentimental engagement with the actual textures of agricultural life that reads as idealized only to those accustomed to a more barbaric countryside. Augustus was anxious to reawaken in the Romans a sense of national pride and enthusiasm for their ancestral religion and their traditional moral values, bravery, parsimony, duty, responsibility, and family devotion. Virgil, too, as a countryman at heart, felt a deep attachment to the simple virtues and religious traditions of the Italian people. Augustus's agricultural program coincided happily with Virgil's own feelings about rural life and his love for Italy. It was a fortuitous conjunction of the conviction of a poet and a national need for its expression. When Virgil in the Georgics makes propaganda for the re-agrarianization of Italy, speaking out against the latifundia, the vast estates worked by slaves that were replacing the small farms of free citizens, he is not simply following imperial orders. He genuinely believes it. He believes that the human being who works a small farm with his own hands, in harmony with the cycles of nature, is closer to the good life than any city dweller or political schemer. Labor omnia vincit improbus, persistent labor conquers all things. That line from the Georgics became, through the centuries, one of the founding mottos of Western civilization. It would echo in the rule of Saint Benedict, in the Protestant work ethic, in the ideology of every civilization that made a virtue of diligent labor. And Virgil placed it in a poem about bees and olive trees. Virgil and Maecenas are said to have taken turns reading the Georgics to Octavian upon his return from defeating Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. The image is almost too perfect, the emperor fresh from the last and decisive battle of Rome's civil wars, listening to a poem about the peaceful cultivation of the earth, being read to in shifts by his poet and his chief adviser. It was the programmatic moment of the Augustan age, war ending, culture beginning. And then came the Aeneid. 11 years of work. 12 books of dactylic hexameter. 9,896 lines. The founding myth of Rome, and arguably the founding myth of Europe. The Aeneid was written in a time of major political and social change in Rome, with the fall of the Roman Republic and the final war of the Roman Republic having torn through society and many Romans' faith in the greatness of Rome severely faltering. However, the new Emperor Augustus began to institute a new era of prosperity and peace, specifically through the reintroduction of traditional Roman moral values. The poem tells the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince, son of the goddess Venus, who flees the burning of Troy carrying his elderly father on his back and leading his young son by the hand. He wanders the Mediterranean, like Odysseus before him, buffeted by storms and divine hostility. He falls in love with Dido, queen of Carthage, and abandons her to follow his destiny, and Dido, betrayed and heartbroken, curses him and his descendants, and takes her own life. Aeneas reaches Italy, fights the indigenous Latins, and establishes the settlement that will eventually, through his descendants, become Rome. The poem compares itself to Homer throughout, and the comparison is both inevitable and fundamentally misleading. The spirit is entirely different. Where Homer's Iliad moves with the speed and directness of a thrown spear, the Aeneid moves with a melancholy and monotonous dignity. Where Homer's heroes are driven by personal honor and glory, by the desire to be remembered, to be sung, Virgil's Aeneas is driven by duty. By pietas. By the obligation to carry something larger than himself into the future, even at enormous personal cost. The ghost of Aeneas's father describes Rome's mission as one concerned with government and civilization compared with the Greek achievement in art and literature. Rule the people with your sway, spare the conquered, and war down the proud. This is the vision of Rome's destiny that Augustus and Virgil had before them, that Rome was divinely appointed first to conquer the world in war and then to spread civilization and the rule of law among peoples. But there is something else in the Aeneid, something that makes it a greater poem than its official mission might suggest. Virgil was too honest, too melancholy, too much the man who had almost lost his father's farm to write pure triumphalism. There is throughout the Aeneid a persistent awareness of what is being lost, of the cost of empire, of the grief embedded in even the greatest victories. Sunt lacrimae rerum, "There are tears in things," is perhaps the most famous line in all of Latin poetry, and it is not a line of triumph. It is a line of sorrow. It is Aeneas weeping before a mural depicting the fall of Troy, recognizing that even here, in foreign Carthage, people know the story of his people's destruction. The Aeneid is full of prophecies about the future of Rome and the deeds of Augustus. The shield of Aeneas even depicts Augustus's victory at Actium against Mark Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC. The poem is, at one level, unambiguously Augustan propaganda. But at another level, it is something more personal and more troubling. It is the poem of a man who believes in the ideal of Rome while knowing, with the knowledge of the artist and the countryman and the melancholic, that ideals always cost something. That history always requires sacrifice. That even the greatest destinies leave wreckage in their wake. Dido is that wreckage. She is the most fully realized character in the Aeneid, and she is the character whom Aeneas destroys. He does not destroy her out of cruelty, he destroys her out of duty. He leaves because the gods tell him to leave. And she kills herself because he left. And the poem does not resolve this moral complexity. It holds it open. It lets the reader feel both the necessity of Aeneas's departure and the unbearable injustice of it simultaneously. That is not propaganda. That is art. Virgil belongs to a declining age. Rome in the 1st century BC was not, despite the triumphs of Augustus, a civilization of simple virtue and clarity. It was a civilization emerging from decades of civil war, moral chaos, and political violence. The Rome that Augustus was trying to rebuild was in many ways a fiction, a recreation of an idealized past that had never quite existed. And Virgil knew this. He knew the distance between the ideal and the reality. But instead of simply representing that reality, as a naturalist or a social realist might, he chose to invent an ideal world that was better than the one around him. He presented artificial saints and heroes because no real ones existed. He created a vision of Roman virtue, of labor, justice, and compassion, not because he saw it all around him, but because he feared it was disappearing and needed to be preserved in art. Not ignorant of suffering, I learned to help the wretched. That line, spoken by Dido to the arriving Trojans, encapsulates something essential about Virgil's moral imagination. It is not the ethics of the strong. It is the ethics of those who have suffered and who therefore know what it means to suffer. It is the ethics, we might say, of someone who almost lost his family's farm. Virgil, not as a Roman but as a Roman intellectual, belongs to the resistance. He opposes the moral chaos of his age with the ideals of rustic labor, impartial justice, and compassion for the afflicted. And he wraps all of this in altum silentium, the deep silence, of his musical verse. The real sun and moon of Italy rise and set over the pale characters and painfully invented events of the Aeneid. But the music of the verse makes it feel like truth. There is a useful distinction here, drawn from Schiller, between naive poetry and sentimental poetry. Naive poetry, Homer is the supreme example, flows directly from the world, from experience, from unreflective engagement with life. Sentimental poetry is the poetry of longing, of the gap between the ideal and the real, of the intellectual who knows he cannot simply inhabit the world but must instead construct a vision of it. Virgil is the supreme example of sentimental poetry. And it is precisely this quality, this melancholic distance from the ideal he creates, that makes his work so enduringly powerful for every age that has felt itself to be living in a time of decline. Among all of Virgil's works, one passage stands apart in its extraordinary afterlife, the 4th Eclogue, written around 40 BC, a short poem celebrating the birth of a child who will usher in a new golden age. Magnus ab integro seclorum nascitur ordo, the great order of the ages is born anew. A child will be born, the poem says, under whose reign the earth will no longer need to be tilled, lions will roam safely among cattle, serpents will die, the old poisons will disappear. There will be peace. There will be abundance. There will be a new world. Virgil was most likely writing about a specific child, possibly the son expected from the political marriage of Mark Antony and Octavian's sister, a dynastic child who would seal the short-lived peace between the two men. But the child was never born, or never survived, and the prophecy hung in the air without its referent. And then Christianity arrived. And the Church Fathers read the fourth eclogue, and believed they saw an unmistakable prophecy of the birth of Christ. Here was a pagan poet, writing 40 years before the Nativity, describing the coming of a child who would transform the world. How could this be explained? Only by divine inspiration. Only by the hand of God reaching back through time and giving Virgil words that pointed, without his knowing it, toward the Word made flesh. In what became a Christian culture, Virgil was viewed as a pagan prophet because several lines in his works were interpreted as predictions of the coming of Christ. Among writers of the Renaissance, Virgil was appreciated for the fluidity of his rigorously structured poetry and his vivid portrayals of human emotion. The Middle Ages made Virgil into something between a saint and a wizard. Stories circulated that he had magical powers, that his tune protected Naples from harm, that he had built supernatural devices that could predict the future. And in the greatest poem of the medieval Christian world, Dante's Divine Comedy, Virgil became something even stranger, the embodiment of pagan reason itself, the soul who, through natural human wisdom, had understood something of the truth without having had access to revelation. Dante guessed correctly. Virgil is the representative of what the tradition called reason, not baptized, not Christian, but naturally inclined toward what Christianity would articulate. He is naturaliter Christiana, Christian by nature. And so the man who had written imperial propaganda for Augustus became, in Dante's poem, the guide through hell and purgatory, the pagan sage who could lead the Christian poet through the underworld precisely because he understood suffering, duty, and the moral structure of the cosmos, even without the theology to name it. On his deathbed, Virgil composed a short, subtle epitaph for himself, which his friends inscribed on his tomb in Naples. The epitaph translates as, "Mantua gave me birth, Calabria took me away, and now Naples holds me. I sang of pastures, farms, leaders." Pastures, farms, leaders. The eclogues, the Georgics, the Aeneid. The entire arc of a life's work compressed into a single Latin hexameter, the form he mastered, turned on itself one last time in the service of autobiography. It is the most economical self-description in literary history. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, his fame only grew. Before the invention of the printing press, when classical texts were scarce, Virgil's poetry was available to the literate classes, among whom he was regarded as the most significant writer of antiquity. He inspired poets across languages, including Dante in Italian, Milton in English, and an anonymous French poet who reworked the Aeneid into the medieval romance Le Roman d'Aenéa. What is the content of this immense influence? Why does Virgil endure when so many ancient poets have faded? The central idea of his entire work is the utopia of a golden age. In the eclogues, it is a romantic utopia, the ideal landscape of pastoral peace. In the Georgics, it is a social utopia, the vision of a society organized around honest labor and harmony with nature. In the Aeneid, it is a political utopia, the vision of an empire governed not by force alone but by justice, mercy, and duty. And Virgil knows, with bitter melancholy, that the distance between that ideal and his actual age is enormous. Fugit irreparable tempus, time flies, irretrievable. One of the most quoted lines in all of Latin literature, and it comes from a poem about beekeeping. Time escapes us. The golden age recedes. The ideal remains unreachable. And yet, and this is the crucial move, even in that melancholy, Virgil does not give up. He holds the ideal open. He says, perhaps. Perhaps someday. Forsen edi hecolim miminis jovabit, perhaps one day it will be a joy to remember even these things. The line that Dante heard across 13 centuries and recognized as his own, after the defeat of his own political utopia. Homer is greater, without comparison. Homer's speed, his directness, his way of placing you immediately and irreversibly inside the living moment, these are qualities that Virgil consciously chose not to have, or could not have. Virgil is not Homer. He never tries to be Homer. He imitates Homer constantly and transforms every imitation into something entirely different. But here is what Virgil offers that Homer cannot, the music of melancholy. The art of longing. The transformation of anxiety into beauty. The knowledge, hard won, earned through the near loss of his family's farm and through 11 years working on a poem he considered unfinished, that labor omnia vincit, labor conquers all. Not because labor always succeeds. Not because the golden age will arrive. But because the work itself, the attention, the care, the refusal to stop, is the closest thing to the golden age that human beings can actually create. Homer is greater. But Virgil is ours. On September 21, 19 BC, Virgil died in Brundisium. He never finished the Aeneid. He wanted it burned. Augustus said no. And so it survived, imperfect, with lines left metrically incomplete, with an ending that some readers find abrupt and troubling, Aeneas killing his defeated enemy in anger rather than mercy, a final act that sits uneasily with the poem's stated ideals. Perhaps Virgil wanted to burn it precisely because he knew that last scene was wrong. Or perhaps he knew that the whole poem was wrong, that no poem could carry the weight he had tried to give it. That the ideal always exceeds the work. That the golden age always remains just beyond the reach of the verse. We'll never know. What we have is what Augustus gave us, the unfinished poem. The almost perfect thing. The work of a shy man from Mantua who fled from his own fame, who preferred bees to emperors, who believed in justice and labor and compassion, and who spent 11 years trying to say so in the most beautiful Latin anyone has ever written. Father of the West, they called him. Not because he was the most powerful. Not because he was the most original. But because he was the one who taught every subsequent age, the monks of Saint Benedict, the humanists of the Renaissance, the poets of the Romantic movement, and us, right now, how to transform the anxiety of living in a declining age into something that might last. That might endure. That might, one day, be worth remembering. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story.